Chris says to his wife, Dana, he says, I think you should let me go. And she apparently leaned in and said, you are still Christopher and I still love you. He says something like, if I had detected any hint of nobility in what she was saying, then I would have made a different decision. She said those words, she meant it, and she was going to stick with him. Hello guys, back again. I'm Zahir, and today I'm going to be talking about Superman, the Christopher Reeve Story, which is the documentary that was released recently about the life and the tragic life of Christopher Reeve, who was known for playing Superman in the late 70s and early 80s, who then in the mid-90s, ended up suffering from a spinal cord injury that left him paralyzed from the neck down. This is really a story about a husband, about a father, about an icon in many ways, and what he became, after he suffered this terrible, terrible tragedy. Let's get into it. Big spoilers for the documentary Superman, the Christopher Reeve Story. His Superman was my hero growing up. He was, in many ways, he's kind of the model of a man. When I was 5-6 years old, of course, I wanted to be Superman. That's why, of course, I have all of these Superman t-shirts. So the documentary opens in, quite a positive way, as you can imagine. They've got the iconic John Williams score from 1978 and shot from the 1978 movie of Christopher Reeve in his Superman costume, flying around, saving people. Just a nice little supercut of different scenes from the movie, and him as Clark Kent and all of these things. And it was kind of a nice bit of nostalgia. I think they actually had a screening of the 1978 movie at the IMAX directly after the screening of the documentary. But I mean, I'd seen the movie last month. I made a video on that, so you'll probably be able to see a card on the screen right now if you want to go back and see that video right now. But yeah, it was very nostalgic. It took me back, seeing all of those scenes once again with Christopher Reeve and in his iconic suit, being Superman, doing Superman stuff, saving Lois and the helicopter, and seeing him fly around in the Fortress of Solitude, and seeing him, I think he ended up saving the president as well on Air Force One. That's one of the scenes in the movie. And so, just after they've shown sort of the early scenes from that film, they go into the young Christopher Reeve. He was an actor, I think, at the Juilliard School in New York, which is a very reputable school, of course, and he was known to be in an advanced program with Robin Williams. Of course, very well-known comedian himself and actor. He eventually started doing dramatic roles that were not comedic, and apparently they were really good friends. They were really great friends, and both very talented at that time young men. And there's a story that somebody is telling, and they mentioned that Chris ended up saying that, hey, I've got a audition for a role, and at this point Chris is he's off Broadway, so he's a nobody. And a number of different actors, I think, wanted this role. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger was considered for the role, and he would have had absolutely the physique to play Superman, especially when you see Superman now. Essentially, a lot of superheroes today, in the comic books at least, just look like a bunch of bodybuilders. But I can't imagine Arnold with that accent, flying around with the curl on his forehead, playing Superman. Robert Redford. There were a number of other actors that ended up turning down the role, but I think eventually the casting director of the Salkins decided to go with an unknown actor, and so they started doing these auditions in London. I'm wondering if they were doing these because I know that part of Superman was shot in Pinewood Studios. So Christopher ends up going to London to audition, and he's a young guy, and he's a big guy. He's like 6'4". As mentioned, of course, he's a tall guy, good looking guy, has a talent to play this kind of role, but he doesn't yet have the physique. So of course he ends up getting the role. Of course we know where that ends up. He ends up getting the role, this unknown actor, this off Broadway actor, who then ends up landing this huge iconic role. Now, the thing with Superman, when I'm talking about Superman, is not, he's not just a superhero, he's the superhero. If you look at the modern day superhero, he's really kind of the archetype for all of the ones that came after him. I think the first Superman comic was on 38. I think Batman follows not too long after that. But if you look at what a superhero is today, it really begins in modern terms, at least, with Superman. So this is a huge role to be landing, and of course the movie had a massive budget, and they wanted to make 2 movies at the same time as well, which I won't go into too much detail about. Now, as I said, Christopher Reeve was in the advanced program at Juilliard, so he wanted to consider himself, I think, a really serious actor. There's a quote in the documentary about somebody saying to him, hey, you must become a very serious actor, like very serious kind of Shakespearean actor, unless Hollywood comes along and throws a bunch of money at you, in which case go and do that. So it's interesting the sense that some of the actors that are around Christopher Reeve at that time seemed to see him as kind of selling out to do this not very artistic role as Superman. But what I liked to hear in the documentary is that he took the role quite seriously. I think he understood that the gravity of what it meant to be playing an icon like Superman. He's not just an American icon, he's not just a hero icon, he's an icon of masculinity as well. He's the ideal of a man, as they mentioned in Superman, in Man of Steel, where Henry Cavill played the role in 2013. One of the things that's mentioned in the documentary is Christopher Reeve's father. It sounds like his mum and dad had a very tumultuous relationship. It doesn't sound particularly peaceful at all. And it doesn't sound like it lasted very long. I think they both remarried twice, and so there's multiple kids from multiple different parents, and it's something that he mentions that he never really wanted for his own children as well. So quite sad. It sounds like his dad was quite distant from him, quite a stoic man, not in a philosophical sense, but in the sense that he's not kind of open to portraying love or showing love or any kind of encouragement to his sons. So it kind of sounds like Christopher, whether he was doing well in school, getting his grades, or doing well in any other part of his life, his dad just didn't seem to show that much care for him, and that seems to have quite an effect on him as a man, in his attempts to achieve in his life as well. So there's a point in the documentary where they mention that his dad, on finding out that Christopher has gotten this role as Superman, buys a bottle of champagne and wants to celebrate with everyone, and then apparently finds out that, it's Superman. Actually, the superhero is Superman. His dad apparently thought it was a role in Man and Superman, which is a play featuring Don Juan, came out in 1905, I think, and it's a 4-act play. And his dad apparently was not particularly big on his son playing Superman, because it wasn't considered sort of serious acting, and he wanted his son, I guess, to be a serious artist. So when they were shooting Superman, this was a big movie, and I've mentioned in my previous video on the movie that at the time I think it was the most expensive movie ever made, and it was really the first Hollywood blockbuster superhero movie. I'm guessing you'd had some stuff with Adam West in the past. I don't know if you want to include sort of Flash Gordon, those kinds of guys as superheroes, but you'd never seen these big budget movies before by Hollywood on a comic book superhero. And so I really think that if you didn't have this movie, you wouldn't have these big budget $150-200 million superhero movies that we take for granted today. And actually, one of the directors, when they spoke before the movie had began, made this point that all of these Marvel movies and the rest of it, you really wouldn't have it without this 1978 Superman movie. So they started shooting the Superman movie, and I think it was shot at Pinewood and Shepperton here in the UK, I think just outside of London. And they apparently had 100 people on the team, on the Superman fly team, to get Christopher Reeve to fly. And So, they have to get him on these rigs and these pulleys and have him flying around. And I read somewhere that they were using rear projection to do the background stuff. And, the tagline on the movie was, "You'll believe that a man can fly." And of course, the effects don't look so good today, but back then, this was revolutionary stuff. While he was shooting the movie, I think he was having some lunch. He was waiting in line, and he ended up meeting a young woman by the name of Gay Exton, a young British woman. And of course, they end up falling in love. It's a whirlwind romance, and Christopher was very active. He would end up taking her on sort of gliders, so he liked to actually fly in gliders, and very, very active guy. And it sounds like they got on very well, and they fell deeply in love. And the movie, by the way, once it was released, was a huge success, both critically and commercially. Out of the 4 movies that Christopher ended up doing, it's the one that grossed the most. I think it ended up making $300 million, perhaps more than that, back in the 1970s, which is a huge amount of money on something like a $50-something million budget at the time. Though, of course, it was shot at the same time as the second movie. This unknown actor is shot to stardom. I think one of the people in the documentary says, it hits you like a train. It hits you like a train, that kind of stardom. He was an unknown, and now everyone recognizes him. He's in all of the magazines and all of the newspapers and all of the talk shows and all the rest of it. And he's not just a Hollywood actor now. He's this great iconic figure of Superman. That's the way that people see him. So as the documentary progresses, his relationship with Gay Exton continues, and he ends up having 2 children with her. And there's a bit in the documentary where they mention that, of course, they never married, and he said he didn't believe in marriage and things like that. It's interesting. There's a shot in the documentary where you see him leaving a house in what looks like London, looks like one of the fancier parts of London, perhaps Kensington or something. There are sort of these white houses on certain streets that are very, very expensive. So I'm guessing that he was living there. I'm not sure how long the relationship with Gay Exton lasted. In the same sense that it was a whirlwind romance, it kind of ended, in the opposite kind of way. It sounded like that they were having some problems in their relationship. They had I think an apartment or a house in New York somewhere, but Christopher at this time was living with Gay Exton in London, which kind of makes sense because, as I mentioned, some of the big studios, Shepperton and Pinewood, are just outside of London, so it kind of makes sense. And of course, she was in the UK as well. She was British too, so it made sense that he was here. But it sounds like at one point he kind of said, I can't do this anymore, and ended up leaving for New York. And I guess he's a superstar at this point. Tall guy, good looking movie star. He's Superman. And I guess he was looking to explore a little bit, so that's what he did. Chris ended up essentially leaving Gay Exton in London, and there's a moment, it's quite sad, she's in the documentary and she becomes a bit emotional recalling the whole thing. As you can imagine, however many decades on now, it would have been the 80s, I think, that they would have ended up separating. But Chris ended up going to New York, and he ends up meeting a woman by the name of Dana. And similar in a sense, sort of whirlwind romance, and they get to know each other, they fall in love, and they get together. And eventually they end up getting married, which, he wouldn't marry Gay, I guess, but he ended up marrying Dana, and he ends up having a further 2 children. So there's a number of kids that are featured in the documentary. In many ways, they're kind of the stars of the documentary, because they're the ones who are carrying on his legacy. They're the ones who are still talking about their father and talking about the work that he did. I mentioned that Christopher really kind of wanted to consider himself a serious actor, although he was doing this role of Superman with the red and the blue and the yellow, and he's a comic book hero. He still wanted to be a proper actor, and the sense I get that he He didn't like the fact that he wasn't considered a serious actor by his peers, perhaps, but also by the wider audience as well. This is the one role that he was known for, and it reminds me quite a lot of Mark Hamill. Mark Hamill played Luke Skywalker in the original Star Wars trilogy, and that's really what he became known for. He tried to do a number of different things. I remember him in a movie called Mutronics, which was basically the Guyver movie for the anime The Guyver. And he'd been in a bunch of different stuff. I guess he's second to Luke Skywalker. He's known for playing probably the Joker in both Batman the Animated Series and in the Arkham games. But Mark Hamill essentially couldn't find anything, or was not hitting with anything outside of his roles as Luke Skywalker, and that kind of ended up being an albatross for him. It was something that would not leave him, and the same thing kind of happened with Christopher Reeve. He kept doing movies that were quite different to the role of Superman, these dramatic roles, but none of them were really hitting. And I can imagine that didn't do very good things for him. And he took his acting quite seriously. He was in Anna Karenina, and that's where he mentions that he wanted to learn horse riding, because he wanted to be the guy in the shot riding the horse rather than having some stuntman do it. And the thing with horse riding is, I wouldn't have known how dangerous it was until I'd first heard about what had happened to Christopher Reeve back when I was a child, back in the mid-90s. So, he said himself that he got pretty good at it. He got pretty good at horse riding. It sounds like it was something that he took quite seriously. He was quite an active guy. He got to a point actually that he was competing in certain competitions with horse riding. They're jumping over stuff. I know nothing about horse riding or what it means when they're jumping over stuff. I don't even know what that is, but he got pretty decent at it. So with a lot of these things, there's a point where you're taking risks, right? If it's already a dangerous sport, but you're now competing, you now need to be better than other people, which means that, he was taking certain risks. Christopher, in 1995, he's doing his horse jumping, he's riding his horses, and one day, and I think it was May 1995, he wasn't apparently going particularly fast, and it wasn't a particularly difficult jump, but for whatever reason, the horse decided to stop. Chris called it a dirty stop. So a dirty stop is, when the horse begins to jump and then decides no, and then doesn't. And he ends up being flung over the horse and then landing on his head. So he lands on his head. As mentioned in the documentary by Will Reeve, who is Chris's youngest son, by Dana, that, had he landed on his head a little, like an inch one direction, he would have just ended up dead. He just would have ended up dead. And if he had landed an inch in the other direction, it would have hurt a lot, but he would have brushed it off, and it would have been a little bit embarrassing, but he would have carried on. And they show some of the news reports from the time when this accident happened, and apparently, they were talking about him like he was either gonna die, or he was very close to passing. Chris's heart stopped twice on the day of the accident, and they kept trying to bring him back. It could have gone one way or the other. And I don't even know how this is even possible. They mentioned in the documentary that they had to sort of reattach his head. I don't even know what that means, that they had to reattach his head. I don't know the nitty gritty of what the procedure was to try and keep him alive. By the time that Chris ends up waking up, which is sometime later, he's paralyzed from the neck down. And I don't think, I need to emphasize this point too much, but I'm going to anyway. You go from playing Superman, the Man of Steel, a man who is essentially invincible, bullets bounce off him and he can fly in super speed and all the rest of it. You go from this iconic American hero to being somebody who is paralyzed from the neck down. That's an incredibly tragic thing for anyone, but to have that contrast of the person that he had played as an icon to being what he is now at this point. You can imagine what's going through his head. You can imagine what he's thinking. What am I going to do? I have a wife. I have 4 kids. I'm an actor. How am I ever going to work again? And there's a really sad moment in the documentary where Chris says to his wife, Dana, he says, I think you should let me go. I think that you should let me go. And she apparently leaned in and said, you are still Christopher and I still love you. And he says something like, if I had detected any hint of nobility in what she was saying, then I would have made a different decision. Because she had said to him, it's your choice about what you want to do. Because he's being kept alive essentially by all of this care and all of this machinery. And without it, he does not, he can't survive. He has a ventilator. He has a machine breathing for him. And his wife says, it's your choice. You're still Christopher. I still love you. And that moment, there was something about that where he said, if I had detected any nobility in her voice, then I would have made a different decision. But he says that he didn't, when she said those words, she meant it and she was going to stick with him. Really incredibly powerful stuff. I'd heard about what had happened to Christopher, when I was still in primary school at the time. And I'm glad that this documentary came out. I'm glad that somebody is diving into the story and telling it in detail, because these are the kinds of things that you don't hear, when you're in primary school. It's the mid-90s and they're, you're hearing a little bit about it on the news and you're a child, so you don't necessarily understand what is going on. There's an irony somewhere that the movie that Christopher had done before all of this had happened was a role where he plays a police officer who's in a wheelchair. He's not paralyzed from the neck down. He still has use of his hands to wheel himself around, but he's a guy in a wheelchair. And he says that he felt kind of bad because he'd kind of said, well, hey, I'm kind of fortunate that's not me at that time, without realizing that, that was where he was going to kind of end up. Even worse, because he didn't have any movement, any feeling below the neck. There's a very sad moment where they have all this archival footage. Much of the documentary is archival footage where Dana, his wife, is holding his hand, and of course Chris can't feel anything, and she says something like, well, I can feel him, but he can't. And he's just he's sat there not saying anything, because I guess what else are you going to say to that? What are you going to say to that? You can imagine that Chris at this point, he's in a rehab clinic, and he's not able to move anything. He's not able to do anything. They're basically exercising him rather than him exercising himself. And I guess at this point he's thinking about what he's going to do with his life. He's a dad, so I guess he feels like he needs to stick around for his children as well, and he has to decide what he's going to do. And it's mentioned in the documentary that there was a boy who, as a term they used, weaning. The boy was not weaning from the rehab. I'm not quite sure that I understand it, but they decided to wheel in Chris so that Chris could speak to him, and Chris ends up speaking to the boy, and the boy says, of course, well, Superman came and spoke to me and told me that I can do this, so therefore, if he says that I can do it, then I can do it. They say essentially that one moment where he ended up helping that boy and speaking to that boy and giving him an encouraging set of words, tells him that, there's something he can do with this. Although now he's lost his ability to act in the way that he has, he can find a new role in his life. He can find something to do with this for the greater good. And this is the kind of, as if it wasn't heart-wrenching enough, this story. This guy has to find some means by which to carry on, and has to find some means by which to give meaning to his life, and then still find a way to be good for other people, to give other people hope. In many ways, that's really what Superman is, isn't he? Like, this is mentioned in Man of Steel. They sort of changed the canon so that the S symbol is not an S, it's the symbol of the House of El. Superman being Kal-El, his father being Jor-El, the family name is El. So, he's meant to be a symbol of hope. I would say he's more of a symbol of optimism. You might say that they're the same thing. As you can imagine, this takes a toll on the family. He's got young children, he's got a wife, and he'd made a certain amount of money from the Superman movies. They were the ones that were box office hits, but they mentioned that we were better off than most people, but we weren't that much better off. I mean, they mentioned that his care cost $400,000 a year because he needed 24/7 care. He's a paraplegic, he's a quadriplegic. He has no feeling or movement below the neck. He can't breathe by himself. He needs a machine to breathe for him. And so you can imagine, was that $400,000 in the 90s? I don't even know what that is today, but it's a lot of money. And so, he mentions as well that he has to find a way to kind of be a dad. He said something like, he was kind of there more for his kids after the accident than before. And you can imagine that, he can't throw a football or baseball with his kids, but he can kind of be there for them. He can listen to them, he can give them advice, and he can, what else are you going to do? What else are you going to do? That's the choice that he's made for his wife and his kids. It's mentioned also in the documentary that he ends up teaching his younger son, how to ride a bike. There's even a video, I think, of a young Will on a little bike as a young child, and Christopher is in his wheelchair, and he's kind of following along. There's also a very touching moment at some point in the story that I don't think it was even a year after the accident, and Christopher decides to make the trip to the Oscars. And, I think they had this black kind of van truck thing that was specifically designed for him so that they could strap him in so that he could make these long journeys, which are very difficult for him, as you can imagine. And they didn't tell anyone at the Oscars. They didn't let it be known in the press, just in case he had to pull out or he decided not to do it for whatever reason. He apparently, would go through the kind of the back entrance kind of thing, going for the kitchens and going through the where they're delivering stuff. And he said he met a bunch of different people, working people who said, hey, this is Superman. They were glad to see him even in that state, even in the wheelchair, and seeing him as he was. To them he was still Superman. He goes to the Oscars in 1996, and he makes a speech. You can find that speech online, and it's quite emotional, as you can imagine. People are crying. People are, after he's given his speech, he gets a standing ovation, as you can imagine. It's incredible. It's incredible. After this speech at the Oscars, and speaking to this boy in the rehab clinic, and getting all of the letters that he had in support, both from celebrities, public figures, but also just kids and the general public. Christopher decides that he's going to dedicate his life to spinal cord research and to raising awareness and making sure people know what this is and what can be done about it. And so he begins the Christopher Reeve Foundation. He gets some of his friends, he gets his wife to help him, and he goes around the country touring, speaking about spinal cord research and paralysis and disability and all of these things. This is his life now. And I remember watching a movie actually as a child. This is in secondary school now. I think, was it Rear Window, which is a remake of a movie of a guy in a wheelchair who sees some sort of crime. Might have been a murder at a window in a different building. And I remember Christopher Reeve playing that role, and I remember seeing that movie. But he essentially plays himself. He plays himself with all of the machines and the ventilator. And I think there was even a scene in the movie where, there's a certain, I think, medical procedure that needs to be done. They decide to actually kind of do it for real on camera the way it's meant to be done. And, I should mention that one of the difficulties that Christopher ended up having with this is because he couldn't breathe, and for whatever reason the equipment is the way that it is. Every now and again a pipe might pop out and then he can't breathe. So an alarm might go off, but if it takes a couple of minutes for somebody to hear the alarm and then find him and then pop the pipe back in, he's not got any oxygen for that long, and you can imagine that's a terrifying experience. His life at this point is now, raising awareness and giving voice to other people. There was a controversy, and I forget what the advert was for, but there was an advert where they used CGI in the 90s to show Christopher getting up, walking along, and then shaking somebody's hands, and some people got quite offended by that. But I can see what he was trying to do. He was trying to, I guess, do what Superman does, which is, hey, give people some hope. Give people some hope. Give people some hope that it's possible, that science will find a means by which to cure that. To allow people who have suffered this kind of injury to get up one day and then to walk around once again. And at least with some of the research that we're seeing today, and I don't know the nature of the injuries of those people, but we are seeing some people who have suffered spinal cord injuries that are getting up and are able to start walking again. We'll see what science is capable of doing in the next few decades. And I'd like to know. I haven't done any research into this, but I'd like to know, to what degree did the Christopher Reeve Foundation contribute to that, the money that they raised? Because I think they've raised over $100 million at this point. However many decades it's now been open. I think since 96, 97 perhaps. how much has that contributed to the sorts of advances that we're seeing in spinal cord injury? I think there was a story of a guy who they said they used Bluetooth or something to allow him to walk. I didn't quite understand how it worked. Towards the end of Christopher's life, he's raised all this awareness, he's raised this money, he's kind of championing certain people, he's making sure that people are aware that this kind of stuff happens. He mentioned, I think, at the Oscars that 200,000 people live with the kind of injury that he's got, and essentially they're not heard. Because they're not Christopher Reeve, they're not Superman. But towards the end of his life, it seems like there is a bit of hope. You start seeing a bit of movement in his fingers. I think, was it his wife mentioned that, and he said, he was speaking to her, he said something, and then it was a moment where you might be gesturing like I'm gesturing right now, and his finger just moved just a little bit. And so you can imagine that, that's incredible. I think it's about 2005, maybe 2006 at this point. And we're seeing little bits of movement. They show in the documentary videos of Christopher Reeve in a swimming pool. People are holding him up, and he's kind of moving his legs a little bit. So he's able to do that perhaps in the water, but not with, with regular gravity. And so there's little bits of hope that the rehab, whatever it is, something is working. He's getting a bit of movement. He doesn't have what he has before, but there's some hope. And then at some point in the story, it's not clear how this happened, but Chris ends up falling ill. He had an infection, I think, and I think there was a nurse at home with him, and she ends up calling the kids or his wife, because his wife was away, I think, because she was she was an actress. Dana was an actress and a singer, so she's getting on the phone to the family member and is trying to say, like, this is quite serious, and eventually he ends up falling into a coma. And not too long after that, Christopher Reeve ends up passing away. And so, incredibly emotional moment in the documentary. So Christopher Reeve ends up, passing away, I think at the age of something like 52. And, his wife, Dana, ends up taking over a lot of the responsibilities of the foundation. I'm guessing she was integral to running at that time anyway, but her husband is now gone, and so in a sense she has to kind of make it worth it, right? The struggle that she's been through, the suffering that Chris and her family have been through, she has to kind of make it worthwhile. So the way she decides to make it worthwhile is by throwing herself into the same kind of work on the foundation that he was trying to do while he was alive. And there's a very emotional moment where people are giving eulogies. I think this was at the funeral. Robin Williams was there. It's the one time that I've seen Robin Williams crying. Incredibly sad. And Dana Reeve says something like, I made a vow to you in sickness and in health till death do us part. And she says that she has to kind of rescind that because even in death, she still loves him. Really powerful stuff. So the youngest of Christopher Reeve's children, Will, at this point is still quite young, and he's just lost his dad. I think Matthew Reeve, who was the oldest, the half brother, he ends up, I think, moving in and ends up essentially acting as a big brother, as a father for Will, the youngest one, so that the family can carry on, right? And there's a moment where they show a bit of footage of Dana, I think, singing at something, and she has a bit of a cough, and it doesn't seem to be going away, but she, it's something that she's having a bit of trouble with. And then she ends up being diagnosed, when she eventually gets around to seeing a doctor, with stage 4 cancer. And this is a woman that apparently liked to look after herself a bit, and apparently didn't smoke, was not a smoker. To catch this at stage 4, I think she was in her early 40s at this point. I think 41, and now she's been diagnosed with cancer. And there's another very, very powerful moments. There's plenty of those in this documentary, where Will Reeve, the youngest son, of course, now a man being interviewed for this documentary, is in tears himself, or at least on the verge of tears, says, in an 18-month period, in 2005, 2006, he lost his father. He says, I lost my father, I lost my grandmother, and I lost my mother. And since that year, 2006, I have been alone. Very, very, very sad. Just throughout the entire documentary, I feel like the entire thing's about sort of, well, how do you make sense of tragedy? What if the worst thing can happen, and then bad things can just continue to happen? In this case, just sort of one thing after another. just one thing after another, Christopher Reeve, of course, becoming paralyzed, and then Dana ending up getting cancer, and then she ends up passing, and then the kids don't have any parents anymore. I guess in the case of the older two, Gay Exton was still alive, so their mother was still around. And I don't know what role she played in the in the raising of the other children, if any. After the death of their mother, I think all 4 children end up on the board of the Christopher Reeve Foundation. They changed the name to the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, so it's now in honor of both their parents. And they're going around, they're raising awareness, and they're raising money for spinal cord injury and paralysis and disability today. And as I said, it was a bit sad sort of seeing that this is the BFI IMAX. This is kind of the premier venue in the UK for movies. The directors are there at the beginning of the movie, and they're maybe hitting 40% capacity for the documentary. I don't even know if it was 40. It might have been even lower than that. I hope that people watch this documentary. I would urge people to go watch this documentary. If you have any interest in any of this stuff, go and check it out. Even if you don't, I went with somebody to watch this documentary who would not watch something like this and doesn't have too much an interest in this kind of subject matter or comic books or anything like that, and didn't know who Christopher Reeve was. And they, I should warn you that they cried throughout. And it's good to see at least a little bit in the news now that the kids of Christopher Reeve are getting a bit of getting a bit of press time and getting a bit of media time to keep the memory of their father and their mother alive, and to keep alive that message, the importance of research into spinal cord injury and all of those other things. So yeah, really, really powerful stuff, guys. Very, very powerful documentary. I would absolutely recommend that you go and check it out. If you're liking this video so far, guys, please like and share and subscribe and do all the other things. And it really helps. It helps with the algorithm. It helps me grow my channel. That's what I'm trying to do here. So if you like this kind of stuff, please do go ahead and do that. Thanks so much for reaching the end of this video, guys. This is here. I'm going to sign off. I'll leave it there. And I hope that you will go and watch that documentary. I have a bunch of other videos on the channel, of course. There's one that's on the screen right now that is being recommended to you. So maybe check that out. And beyond that, I will bid you a good day. Take care of yourselves.